the picture gets clearer. We next encounter another population called the non-urban elite, also known as the urban poor, with perhaps the exception of merchants, we'll see them later, who usually were not poor. They make 5 to 7% of the total population, but 85% of city populations. These include merchants, artisans, slaves, and day laborers, ergotai, urban day laborers. That's a very broad spectrum of society. For example, merchants, though often very wealthy, were not allowed to reside and sleep inside homes, inside the protection of the walls of the city at night, because they were universally despised in antiquity. So the merchants had to go elsewhere. They were kicked out of the city at night. That's important. Beggars in Jerusalem and merchants, though they had money, were kicked out of the walls. They had to sleep elsewhere. That means if the city gets sieged, who's the first people to get killed or enslaved? These people. They got no protection. And yet, even though they were disliked by most, merchants controlled the trade, profit massively from it, and therefore often enjoyed considerable influence in the upper strata of the society, because many of these merchants were also absentee landlords of rural land and often controlled large amounts of the economic surplus. There are two kinds of day laborers in first century Israel: those who lived in the cities and those who lived in rural areas. The artisans who were in the cities, urban artisans, enjoyed trade guilds, potter guilds, sandal maker guilds, jeweler guilds, and so on. These people make up the bulk of the population of the Judean city. Then there would be the slaves. At the bottom were the day laborers, standing around all day at the gates of the cities, begging to get work. What's very interesting is that when we read the book of Acts, or when we read the letters of Paul, we are largely dealing with an urban non-elites. This is where Paul's ministry takes place. But they're almost completely absent in the Gospels. What does that tell you about Jesus? Was Jesus primarily in the cities?
No.
He's in villages.
But he was.
That's a holdover from stage one, folks. The actual life experience of the historical Jesus. He was rarely in the cities. And when he did get to the city, they killed him.
And probably one of the few then that could read and write.
Jesus?
Yeah.
No. Jesus had memorized the whole book of Isaiah and the Torah. He was illiterate. There are no schools in Nazareth, folks. Where would he have learned to read? Oh, that's right, he's God. I'm sorry. And he knows eight animal kung fu style. I'm not saying you're saying this, but I'm being sarcastic and ridiculous because I want to show we got to take the in and incarnation seriously. If we take the in and incarnation, right? He read in the synagogue in Luke. We have a story in which he reads from the scroll of Isaiah. Okay, here's the thing you got to understand about that. One, reading, as we understand it, in UNESCO style literacy, United Nations understanding, global literacy initiative, I can look at a page, see the characters on it, decipher it, and into meaningful sounds, right? Words, I can translate that. I can read, as we understand Western literacy. There's other kinds of literacy that we would call illiterate by our standards. Oculiteracy or oral literacy. I hear something over and over again and I remember it. And then I can read the whole thing back to you. This practice goes on to this day in the Middle East. You have people who could not understand Arabic in the Quran, and yet they completely have memorized the Quran.
Wow.
And the same thing with Jesus, and these are peasants, folks. The same thing with Jesus and the Torah. He had probably memorized the whole Torah and the whole sections of Isaiah, if not the whole book. That doesn't mean he could actually understand the Hebrew characters. You put him in the right page, he'll know what's the style and what's the thing to say. That doesn't mean he knows. And also, that story in Luke is what stage? Are we getting that story? And the Bible's all true, and some of it actually happened. Does that put a change on things? Okay. Moving right along. Besides the Lucan infancy narrative, within the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus is only seen in Jerusalem one time. According to John, he goes to Jerusalem 3 times, but we're not talking about John, and John is its own thing. The gospel from outer space. This tells us that largely Jesus was not in cities, but almost entirely ministered and healed in the villages and rural areas. In the Gospels, when he does enter Jerusalem, Jesus does interact with some of the retainers and with some of the lay aristocracy and with the high priests, but rarely, only once, and then they kill him. Looking at the urban non-elites, it may surprise you that they make up only a small percent of the total population. This has to do with death rates. The urban non-elite tend to be mostly comprised of people who have lost connections to their extended families and kinship networks, lost their ancestral land, been driven off their land by deaths in the family and or by debt, and have drifted off into the cities and where they have a life expectancy of 6 to 18 months. These people, while found in Acts and the letters of Paul, are almost completely absent from the Gospels.
The people in the chimney really had no clue to who Jesus was until he showed up for the
When he threatened them and their whole world.